So now all we need to do is to figure out if we can find a way to predict those outcomes. What we need to do is to extend our theory so that we can understand how status interacts with expectations. You remember the Bales groups, and I think I mentioned sort of in passing at the time, they were very homogeneous. They were all Harvard undergraduates. They were the same age. Harvard undergraduates were all male, all white, all upper socioeconomic status, all fairly smart. There was almost nothing that distinguished them. That was why it was so striking when the Bales groups always developed an inequality structure, because these people were just so much alike to begin with. Franz and Larson and he and Wang studied heterogeneous groups, and they found very similar findings, except that now you have to say, well, how come this works when they're heterogeneous, when they're not all the same to begin with, and how can we predict that? And of course, homogeneous groups are kind of unusual. Heterogeneous groups are much more common. Most of what you see in any kind of committee that's put together, or a task group in a corporation, or a platoon in a military, they're going to be mixed race, mixed gender, mixed socioeconomic status, mixed age, mixed educational level, all kinds of characteristics that we think of as being status characteristics in our culture. That's just the common one. And the simplest relationship is to say the socially advantaged characteristics will lead to a power and prestige advantage in a task group. That seems to be what we found. There's all kinds of measures of power and prestige, like influence, getting your friends to drink, or price. But whatever the situation is, if there's a socially advantageous group, it is likely to then have an advantage in power and prestige in task groups. Franz and Larson put an expert into the group. Other Bales type groups, when you have age inequality or gender inequality, you get inequality in the power and prestige structure. And there's two differences between heterogeneous and homogeneous groups. In the homogeneous groups that Bales studied, remember he said at the outset of interaction, there was what he called a status struggle. Everybody's trying to speak at once, everybody's trying to exert influence, everybody's trying to take control of the group. After a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, that settles down and you get this power and prestige structure. But there was this undifferentiated phase where there's a struggle going on in the Bales groups. You don't see that if there's gender or age or educational level inequality to begin with. If there's any kind of status inequality to begin with, they don't have that undifferentiated phase and they don't have the status struggle going on. Franz and Larson never saw a status struggle, or at least didn't report it. And second, the inequality is there from the very outset of interaction. Remember we said that in the Bales groups it took 10 or so minutes for the inequality in power and prestige to become evident. If it's a group where they are differentiated by age or gender or educational level or any of the other statuses, the inequality is evident as soon as they start interacting. And it parallels the status inequality. So what's going on? Well, one way we could explain it is to say they're differentiated expectations. They've got a power and prestige structure from the very beginning, and the power and prestige structure is predictable from the status structure. So if we knew that status inequality produces expectation inequality, that would explain it. And in order to do that thoroughly, we need to explain it, explain conditions under which it occurs, and precisely define what we're talking about. In broad terms, it looks like this. Remember what we had 2 weeks ago. Interaction processes, including unit evaluations, influence, and participation, create performance expectations. Performance expectations create power and prestige structure. Remember all that? All we have now is just one additional way that you get performance expectations, and that is status characteristics can produce performance expectations. And if they produce performance expectations, then you get the power and prestige structure. So to explain it, same scope conditions that we had before, except that these are not going to be people who start out equal. They're going to be people who start out with a status difference. Going to make two new definitions. One is a diffuse status characteristic and one is a specific status characteristic. Those are two new terms. And then 5 general propositions to explain what we've seen up till now. So the structure of what I want to do is to show how what we knew about expectation states can be generalized to situations where people start out with status characteristics evident. Because we want to be able to account for task groups where people are different in terms of age, educational level, almost anything. Almost anything that our society gives status value to. So what do you know? Actors treat status characteristics as useful information when they're forming expectations, unless they know for sure that a particular characteristic is irrelevant. And they almost never know that. I mean, how do you know for sure it's irrelevant? They use all the available information. They don't ignore anything. Nothing is a master status, which is so important that once you know that, the others don't matter. Expectations persist when actors enter or leave. And expectations govern the distribution of all the elements of a group's power and prestige structure. Action opportunities, performance outputs, evaluations, influence, beliefs about social worth and ability, choices for leadership, all those things we saw. So what I hope you feel you've got is an explanation for how status affects interaction in task groups. What it does is it creates performance expectations, and the performance expectations then do what we've seen before.